Welcome everyone for Katha Upanishad study and discussion. We are in section 3 of chapter 1. We will go through verses 7 to 11 today. In the next slide, we disclosed the references and the illustrations used in these presentations are learning purpose only. In the next slide, the possible choices of question for discussion. 1. What are the qualities of a seeker that can be inferred from today's verses 7 to 9? 2. What is the route to self-realization that is mapped out by verses 10 and 11? 3. How can we harness the mind to realize Atma? So as usual, we will come back to the question after the presentation. Now I will do quick recap, the summary. In this third section, Lord Yama describes the nature of Jivatma, the Atman, and Paramatma, the Brahman, to Nachiketa. Jivatma and Paramatma are like shade and light. Shadow cannot exist without light. Shade, the Jivatma, has a dependent existence, Mithya, while light, Paramatma, has independent existence, so Satyam. Jivatma, the traveler, has a choice of destination and goals, the Purusharthas. So the four Purusharthas, which we discussed before, the Artha, Kama, Dharma, Moksha, have been combined into Shreyas, spiritual, and Prayas, the materialistic. There are sadhana, practice, path, which are given to achieve these goals. The Jivatma, the traveler, can overcome the fear of death through karma upasanas like Nachiketa fire, which was explained before, and Pancha Yajnas, the Deva Yajna, Pitra Yajna, Brahma Yajna, and Manusha Yajna, and Bhuta Yajna. So for those seeking to be liberated from samsara, the wheel of life and death, karma jnana is the path. So here, verses 3 through 9 describes the spiritual journey, the Jnana Marga. It lays out the conditions for the successful journey. First, the vehicle must be made journey worthy. Here, Lord Yama uses the analogy of a chariot. The human body is the vehicle to attain moksha. The physical body is the chariot, the intellect, the charioteer, the mind, the reins, and the Jivatma, the master of the charioteer. The one without discrimination and an undisciplined mind lose control of the sense organs, function like the unruly horses of the charioteer. The one who has viveka, vairagya, the discrimination, and the disciplined mind control the senses and tame the horses of senses. So now I will hand over to Ranjini to add further and take us to today's verses.
Thank you, Val. So, as Val described, in the last session, the chariot metaphor was introduced, and that continues through in today's verses. And in today's verses, there are two categories. So 7, 8, and 9 talk about what it takes or who is going to get to the ultimate goal and who will not. And then 10 and 11 talk about the roadmap, what it takes to get there. So think about it as two goals that are being addressed in this session. One is what it takes to get there, and the second one is how to get there. So let's start with verse 7. So again, like we have said, we will go through the Sanskrit to English translation. Then we will go through some commentaries. And then the third level of meaning making will be the questions that we will answer in our own group discussion at the end of the session. So let's start with the first one, the Sanskrit to English translation. Yastu avijnanavan bhavati amanaskah sada ashuchihi न सह तत्पदम आपनोति samsaram cha adhigacchati. So yastu is yahatu, but that intellect, you're talking about the intellect, bhavati, that becomes avijnanavan. Avijnana is without any jnana, unskilled, with no insight or discrimination. Amanaskaha, whose mind is not under his control, it is uncontrolled. Sada is always. Ashuchihi is the opposite of suchihi, which is impure. Saha, he, that person, na, does not, apnoti, which is to obtain, tat padam, that goal, cha adhikachati is goes even deeper, reaches, samsaram, worldly existence. So the meaning of this verse is that one, however, who has no discrimination, who has no control over the mind, and is ever impure, reaches not that goal, but gets further into samsara. Now, that goal has been introduced in some of the earlier verses, which is oneness with Brahman or self-realization. Let's go through the next one, or the next two, and then we'll do a little bit of a commentary on it. The next one is just the opposite, and we've seen this pattern a lot in the Upanishads. The first one tells you what is not, and then reiterates what is. So it's almost the same words, excepting it is just the opposite of what we just read. This one said, Yastu vijnanavan bhavati, sa manaskaha sada shuchihi, sahatu tat padam apnoti, yasmat bhuyana jayate. Yahatu, same thing, we talked about the intellect, bhavati, becoming, vijnanavan. The earlier one was avijnanavan. Vijnanavan is an intellect with insight or discrimination. Sa manaskaha, whose mind is controlled. It is working within his control. Sada, always, shuchihi, opposite of ashuchihi in the previous verse, pure. Saha, he, tu apnoti, indeed obtains, tat, that, padam, the goal, yasmat, from which, na, never, bhuyah, again, jayate, is born. So the meaning is, one, however, who has insight, who has controlled the mind and is ever pure, reaches that goal from which one is not born again, right? So when are you not born again? When you have achieved that self-realization, when the Atma and the Paramatma have become one. So what Val has done here is she's picked up a verse from the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 6, text 35, that talks about the same thing. Ashamshayam mahabaho manoturnigraham chalam abhyasena tu kaunteya vairagyena cha grahyate. So Lord Krishna says, O mighty armed son of Kunti, it is undoubtedly very difficult to curb the restless mind, but it is possible by suitable practice and by detachment. Okay, so we're going a little ahead here to say, how do you do it? But here, the first one says, no discrimination, no insight, uncontrolled mind, you're not going to get there. You're going to get mired more and more in worldly desires. And this one says, if you can do that, then you stop this process of birth and death and you will not be born again. And the third one, Vijnana Saradi Yahatu Mana Pragrahavan Naraha Saha Advanaha Param Apnoti Tat Vishnu Paramam Padam. Yah Narahatu, that person who, Vijnana, insight, Saradihi, who has insight as his charioteer, his Saradi, Mana Pragrahavan, with the mind as his reins, Sahahi, Apnoti, reaches or attains, Advana Param, that is the final destination. He crosses, Param is to cross. Tat Paramam Padam, that supreme place or state. And this is very interesting. Vishnu Paramam Padam. Up to this point in time, we've only heard of Brahman. This one says Vishnu Paramam Padam. meaning one who has a discriminative intellect as the charioteer and who has a disciplined mind as the reins, reaches the destination of the journey, that supreme abode of Vishnu. And in brackets, the qualifier here is the nature of the all-pervading Brahman. So these three talks about essentially the same thing. And this one summarizes the first two to say, he who has discrimination and insight as his charioteer, he reaches that final destination. And what is that final destination? The final destination here is described as Vishnor Paramam Padam, the final abode of Vishnu. So this caught my attention because up to this point in time, we have not talked about Vishnu or Shiva or any of the gods. It only talks about Paramatma or Atma in these texts. So I started to look for what is the reference to Vishnu in this, what does it symbolize? And I've picked up three different commentaries. So the first one is Ramanuja's from the Brahma Sutras, where he describes this as the ultimate destination or realization related to the highest self, symbolizing freedom from the cycle of birth and death. There's a second reference, again by Ramanuja, the ultimate destination or realization attained through understanding the highest self. And the third is symbolizes the ultimate destination or spiritual goal, representing the attainment of divine consciousness or realization. Now, these may seem very subtle, right? But again, Ramanuja, Vishnor Paramam Padam, he says this is when an individual has realized that his spiritual goal, attaining the divine consciousness or realization, that is by understanding his highest self. So it starts with the self, and self-realization leads to attainment of that divine consciousness. That is Ramanuja's perspective. Let's look at Shankara's. Shankara Bhashya on the Katha Upanishad says, the spiritual aim of not being reborn, a state of liberation and freedom from the cycle of samsara. Essentially the same thing that Ramanuja is saying, but he's added this, the fact that you're breaking the cycle of birth and rebirth. The second explanation he gives is the final aim or purpose of one's spiritual journey, often connected to reaching enlightenment or divine union. Very similar to what Ramanuja says. And the third one, a spiritual goal symbolizing the realization of the supreme and the nature of the all-pervading Brahman. Now remember, Shankara says there's no difference between Atman and Brahman, the difference between Advaita and Visishtadvaita. And here, but essentially, if you look at it, they're both saying that Vishnur Paramam Padam it's a metaphor, or that is what symbolizes this attainment of the divine goal, and each one has a slightly different nuance to it. And then Madhvacharya, he says the ultimate realm of existence associated with the Lord Vishnu, symbolizing supreme spirituality and bliss. So this again is very interesting, right? Because Madhva is a dualistic philosophy, and for Madhvacharya, Vishnu is the ultimate. So Vishnu Praptam, Vishnu Loka, that is the ultimate. To him, that is the Sagun Brahman as well as the Nirguna Brahman. Whereas Ramanuja and Shankara still talk about Vishnu as symbolizing the Nirguna Brahman. Whereas in Madhva's commentary, they're both one and the same. I'm sorry, they're not one and the same. The duality, he says Vishnu Loka, it is the ultimate. His description of Nirguna Brahman is also Vishnu. So again, if you go back to the three verses that we just talked about, what are the three qualities of a seeker that are inferred by these verses? Now, we've gone through many verses. They've talked about many qualities of a seeker. But if you look at these three, first one is Vijnanam, right? It says Avijnanam, Vijnanam. Vijnana is the discriminating intellect, the ability to distinguish between Shreyas and Preyas. The second canto of the Upanishads talked a lot about Shreyas and Preyas, right? Picking the easy, picking something that promises material progress versus the more difficult Shreyas. The more difficult Shreyas is making those hard choices that help you get towards your spiritual goal. That is discrimination. That is what is the discriminating intellect. Right? If you have to describe what is a discriminating intellect, what am I supposed to discriminate between or among. It is this, that for every decision, every choice that we make, you have a choice of prayas or shreyas. Let me do what's easy. Let me do what's going to help me move forward in this life versus how am I doing this? Where is it going to get me? Why am I doing it? And sometimes, or having the courage and the discrimination to make the tougher choice because it is in the interest of your spiritual progress. That is vijnana. The second one is a disciplined mind, and that's a process. No mind comes into this world already disciplined because we've talked about, all the vasanas and the karmas and everything that is inherited. And as we continue, as we get more and more into this worldly samsara, it becomes even more difficult to control the mind. So the disciplined mind, chitta shuddhi, is achieved through chitta ekagrata. That is a single pointed ability to focus and concentrate, and also emotional stability. So chitta ekagrata is a starting point, right? The fruit of this chitta ekagrata, the fruit of this concentration, this dharana, this dhyana, that you can achieve through meditation, through bhakti, that is the prasada of purity. The prasadam that you get of this single pointedness of the mind, the single pointedness of the heart, whether it is bhakti or whether it is a meditative jnana. And yoga is the means to develop this ability through dhyana and dharana. So for those of us who've been practicing yoga, who've read the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, you know that this is, in the Yoga Sutras, yoga is the means to develop this single pointedness and this control of the mind. Third attribute or third trait is samanaska, with mindfulness. A mind that has discerned Brahman, or the true nature of the self, and lives in awareness of that realization. That's how this has been described. A pure mind free of distractions of the material world. And now, mindfulness, you and I can achieve it. We may not have realized Brahman. You may not have realized the true nature of the self. But if you're aware of this true nature of the self, if you're aware of the Brahman, if you're aware of the impermanence of material existence, that already is a discerning mind. And being aware in the present moment, like mindfulness, in the modern context is very often described as being in the moment, right? So don't live in the past, don't live in the future, live in the present. But samanaska, according to the Upanishads, is much more than that. It is that mindfulness, it is that humility, it is that surrender that you get when you realize that there is a power much bigger than you, much higher than you. And everything you have, whatever you can cognize through the intellect, is nothing compared to that vast consciousness of which you are a part. And we've talked about this, right? That you are not going to get it through intellectual debate. You're not going to get to it through the intellect. But the intellect is all you have. This is the tool we have. So what can you do to cultivate that discernment, cultivate that humility, cultivate that surrender, is to realize that you need to go beyond that. Someone who's even aware of that and lives every moment with that realization, samanaska. Okay, and of course, as it's a continuum, we can start with just trying to remain in the present. A pure mind free of the distractions of the material world is the next definition of it. So of these three verses, as I said, these three talk about what it takes to attain the goal. And in that, we spent a little bit of time talking about the phrase Vishnur Paramam Padam. And then these three verses also kind of imply these three things as qualities of a seeker. This is not all. It's just related to these three verses, talks about Vijnana, Chitta Shuddha, and Samanaska. All right. We'll come back to this in our question and answer session. But let me move on to 10 and 11, which pretty much lays out the roadmap. So first one says, what does it take to get there? Who's going to get there? This one says, how do you get there? Indriyebhya parahi artha, arthebhya cha param manah, Manasat para buddhi, buddhe atma mahan parah. So those of you who sat through or who attended the Patanjali Yoga Sutras will be very familiar with this hierarchy of evolution according to Sankhya. And we will do both, the Vedanta as well as the Sankhya. Artha are the objects. Parahi are higher indeed. Indriyebhya than the sense organs. Paramcha and superior. Arthebhya to the sense objects. Manaha is the mind. Paracha and even higher. Manasaha than the mind is buddhi, the intellect. Para, higher. Buddhe, than the buddhi. Atma Mahan is the great self. Beyond the sense organs are the rudiments of objects. And beyond the objects is the mind. Beyond the mind is the understanding. And beyond the understanding is the great self. Okay? Let me go through the next one also, and then Val is going to talk a little bit about the diagram on the right, which many of you have seen from the Yoga Sutras. The next one's related, so I thought it'll be easier to do both together. The next one says, Mahatha param avyaktam, avyaktat purusha paraha, purushatma param kinchit, sa kasthasa paragatihi. Param, beyond, Mahatah, the great self, Avyaktam, is the one that is not manifest, the unmanifest. Para, higher, Avyaktat, than the unmanifest. Purusha is Purusha, that which fills the entire universe, the supreme being, the Brahman, or the supreme consciousness. Purushat, than the Purusha and a Param, Kinchit, there is nothing higher. Sakashtha, the culmination, the peak, so that is Paragatihi, the final or the ultimate goal. So let's go through this hierarchy. So the first verse stopped with what is above the buddhi, manaha, buddhi, and then mahat. It talked about the great self. This one says, what is beyond that? Beyond the great self is the unmanifest. Beyond the unmanifest is Purusha, that which fills the universe. Beyond that Purusha, there is nothing higher. That is the end of the journey. That is the final goal. So it's very interesting that we're coming across Sankhya terminology and Sankhya philosophy in the text of Vedanta, right? And I was going through a lot of commentaries where many of them have said this is not Sankhya at all. They have given meanings to prove why this is not Sankhya. It doesn't matter. I think for our purposes, many of us are familiar with the Sankhya philosophy. And on the next page, I've also provided the cosmology according to Vedanta, which there are parallels. So let's not get caught up about, in Vedanta, why are we talking about this? Let's just talk about what they tell us about what is the route or the path to self-realization. Val, would you like to take us through this
Yes,
on the right? Thank you.
thank you. So Sankhya philosophy shows us the way or the map how we traveled to get here, the evolution, so that we can trace the same route back to home, to our spiritual origin, the involution. So in the beginning, there was Brahman, the creator, the universal consciousness. This formless being became two aspects, the Purusha and Prakriti. Purusha is the masculine, unmanifest, passive, attributeless, pure being, and Prakriti is the feminine, the animating force of creation. Thus, Prakriti gives form to all beings, while Purusha is the witness consciousness. So, from Purusha and Prakriti, Mahat is born. Mahat is translated as cosmic intellect or universal intellect. It is the self-reflective quality of the consciousness. It not the intellect it is not the intellect we commonly say or associated with the word. It is the innate intelligence. For example, mango tree knows how to produce mango. That's what that intelligence. From Mahat, Ahamkara is formed, the I maker, the sense of I and mine. So once this I is formed, the Ahamkara is formed, the cosmic intelligence, the Mahat, becomes Buddhi, which has the capacity to reason and discriminate and has individualized awareness. Mahat is universal intelligence, while Buddhi is individual intelligence. The formation of Ahamkara, the ego, causes the universe to be experienced as outside and separate from oneself. And the universe is experienced as pervaded by three main qualities, the sattva, rajas, tamas. So we won't go into the details of the sattva, rajas, tamas. So the union of rajas and sattva create the five sensory faculties, the jnanendriyas, the organs of knowledge. These are the ear, skin, eyes, tongue, and nose. It also creates the five motor organs, the karmendriyas, the mouth, hands, feet, reproductive and excretory organs. Next, the rajas combine with the tamas, the force of inertia, to create the objective universe. Their union produces the Panja Tanmatras, or the five objects of sensory perception, which are sound, touch, form, taste, and smell. Finally, the five Tanmatras give rise to the five elements, the space, air, fire, water, and earth. And this is what used in Ayurveda as five elements. So each element manifests from the addition of its Tanmatra, and then in the involution it goes back. So the five elements merges with the five elements of the macrocosm, and we go back to the Purusha. And now I'll hand over to Ranjini to add further.
Thank you, Val. So one thing that you might find, again, it talks about the objects of the senses as higher than the senses themselves. So if you think about it, it talks about the senses as the grossest level, and then the objects of the senses, right? And at first glance, you wonder, it says beyond the sense organs are the rudiments or objects. So you wonder, it's like, the objects are something external to us. Why are they considered subtler than sense organs, right? So this is going from gross to subtle. It says the grossest are the sense organs, and then it's the objects of the senses. And initially, when you read it, you think, wait, shouldn't the object outside, it's a gross object, and then my senses. But then if you look at this chart on the right, the Tanmatra starts to explain it. So you've got your sense organs, you've got your ear, nose, mouth, throat. But the function, the Tanmatras, are sound, touch, vision, smell, and speech. So the objects, the stimuli received by your senses, the internal image or the object that is created comes from your Tanmatras. It's a higher form of functioning, which is because of which the senses here are considered gross, and the objects of the senses, that is, once it has been, that sensory stimuli has been received by your brain, that is considered slightly subtler. So what is this, right? So Val walked us through the Sankhya to say, at the bottom, at the very grossest level, you've got the sense organs, you've got the motor organs, the Tanmatras and the Mahabhutas, and then you've got Ahankara, Buddhi, Mahat, Purusha, Prakriti, you've got that on the right. Cosmology, according to Vedanta, it's almost the same. You flip it. At the bottom is the Indriya, the five organs of sense perception. Artha is the sense objects. Again, to be understood exactly like this, the sense objects is once your brain has received those signals from your sense organs, the objects that form Artha, Manas, the mind, Buddhi, the intellect, Mahat, and in Vedanta cosmology, it's Hiranyagarbha, the first manifest creation, the great soul, the total intellect. Prakriti is unmanifest, Akasha, Maya, and Parama Purusha, the self, the Brahman, or the supreme. So I thought it would be helpful to compare the two because of all of us, many of us have studied Sankhya philosophy, we were exposed to it during the Yoga Sutras, and now in the Upanishads we come to the same. So we compared the two. At the end of the day, it is very interesting to somebody who studies it to see how it compares. But for the practitioner, for the seeker, let's talk about how is this relevant. So what does this imply? This is a journey inwards. So what they're talking about here, so the map that they're drawing up is to say, you have to, that disciplined mind, the vijnana, the samanaska, the discipline, how are you going to get it? You move from the gross to the subtle, from just, if your senses are running wild, your senses run wild when the mind is running wild. So you live a life of sensual pleasure, you're not discriminating. You first have to control that. You control the mind. When you control the mind, the buddhi comes under your control. When that comes under your control, you're able to sense into that supreme consciousness. And then you keep proceeding further and further and further. So it's really an inward journey. This realization of the self, this roadmap that Yama is laying out for Nachiketa is nothing more than what we have seen in several of the other texts that we've studied, which is this internal journey where you're going in, where you're disconnecting from all the material, worldly attractions and desires, all the things that Nachiketa said he doesn't want anything to do with. When Yama kept telling him, I'll give you, I'll give you, I'll give you this, he kept saying, I don't want it. And so Yama, in this verse, which is one of the most popular verses, he affirms Nachiketa's insight, a 12-year-old's insight, in saying, I don't want any of those, by saying, yes, this is what you need to do. You've already given up all that. You've given up attachment to those things, right? And this is the path, Nachiketa, to self-realization. So we'll stop with that and let's go back to the questions. We started with these questions to say, what are the qualities of a seeker that can be inferred from these verses? We talked about that, right? The vijnana, the samanaska. What is the route to self-realization? We just talked about that. You know, the inversion, that inner route from the gross to the subtle. And then the final question, which is a question we're going to ask every time, to say, how can we control or harness the mind to realize Atman? Now, there will be answers to that Yama gives Nachiketa, which will be, a lot. But it's helpful for us to start thinking about where is our understanding now? Where is our practice today about controlling and harnessing the mind? And everybody is going to have, a different way of doing it. We've got the bhakti yoga, jnana yoga, raja yoga. You've got, karma yoga. You've got all these ways. Everybody has their own personal practices. And it helps us, so before we start getting into Yama's answers, to see where is our understanding right now. Again, these questions are not meant to constrain the conversation, but just to open it up for discussion. So we are starting to get into the much more abstract, the more difficult. And all I can say is if it was easy, we wouldn't be spending so much of time studying it. But every one of us has some inkling of an answer. We may not have the whole answer yet, but every one of us tries something. We try a little bit because we're aware that the life we're living today is not it. That's not all of it. There is a greater purpose. And if there is a greater purpose, what can I do to harness my mind? What can I do to harness my intellect? What are the practices that I can follow in my journey towards self-realization? Okay, so let me stop with that.